Hi Ben, you're here today to talk about David Lewis with me. And by all accounts, this chap he was an interesting character, wasn't he?
Yes, he was an interesting character. In my view, he was the greatest of the 20th century analytic philosophers. I think he was a brilliant philosopher. But yeah, as a man, he was an interesting man as well. I mean, interesting in the sense that he was kind of uninteresting, that his whole life was really philosophy. I mean, well, philosophy and trains, apparently. So he used to like to go and look at trains a lot, talk about philosophy, write about philosophy, think about philosophy, look at some more trains, and that was kind of his life as far as I understand it. But
he's a train spotter.
A bit. So he once came to Nottingham University to give a talk, and he was insisted on going to a particular pub afterwards because there was a train station that ran past or right next to the pub, and the trains would run past it.
So he got his notebook out.
Yeah, so apparently he sat the whole time afterwards, just pretty much ignoring what everyone was saying because he got so excited by the trains that he was noting passing by. So yeah, interesting in that sense, an interesting character. But what a mind! He was philosophically, he was absolutely brilliant.
Well, let's talk about that. Now, you and I suppose, team teach David Lewis stuff, and we're going to talk about the material that we teach, the idea of possible worlds and all that.
Yeah.
But I get the impression that that's just the tip of the iceberg. David Lewis made contributions to, well, every branch of philosophy in some sense. So I'm wondering, could you maybe perhaps speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. The thing is about David Lewis is that he did span so many areas. I know predominantly about his metaphysics, and that's, I think, what we're going to be talking about predominantly today. And that's what he's most well known for. But he made very important contributions in moral philosophy, an account, indeed, of what it is or what moral properties consist in. So I think his account is what gets called a response-dependent account of moral properties. But don't press me on the details of that view because I don't really know. And he also made huge contributions in the philosophy of language, on the idea of conventional meaning, and in semantics. He was just a fabulous. Philosophy of logic. He wrote an important book on mereology. That's the logic of the part-whole relation, for example. In his later work, he was working on the philosophy of quantum mechanics. So he's got an important paper on a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics called the many worlds interpretation. It's an argument against it. So yeah, and everything he seemed to write has got this kind of clarity to it, and takes the topic by the scruff of the neck and really sort of gets to the important points. A brilliant philosophy. Yeah. I guess the last thing that I'll mention on this is there's a couple of recent volumes come out of his philosophical correspondence, his letters that he sent other philosophers, and voluminous. It's in 2 big volumes. All of these letters. They're being put together, edited by Helen Beebe at Manchester University, and the letters are just, I've never seen anything like it. You can open this book and find a letter on a topic which you never knew that David Lewis was interested in. It might be a topic in Leibniz's historical view on Leibniz or something like this, and you open it up and he's written a letter to someone about it, and it's almost like it's good enough to be a published paper. These letters, his breadth seems to have been absolutely incredible.
So this new publication, has it revealed anything new, or has it revealed areas of interest that he might not necessarily be associated with? It's an interesting thought, though, isn't it? Philosophical letters. I mean, probably in the continental tradition of philosophy, we have very famously Heidegger's letters back and forth to Hannah Arendt. And, well, people read that basically for gossip, I think, more than anything.
Right.
But is there, do you think there's something about the letter writing form, I guess is what I'm asking, but do you think there's something about the letter writing form that's different to his published work?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think so. It is almost like he's writing short philosophical papers in his letters. It's as good as and the same kind of content as you find in his published papers. So he had a very, very nice style of writing, which he apparently worked on quite considerably. Basically, that was an influence of Quine. So another one of the greatest 20th century analytical philosophers was Willard Van Orman Quine, and Lewis studied under him as a student for a while and adopted or admired Quine's style, and you can see that influence Lewis's style. So he's got this very direct, to the point, way of writing. Exemplifies brevity, so it's really quite condensed reasoning, and his letters are just like that. So he's published papers like that, and the letters are the same. So no, I don't think I can see any difference in style or in the way in which he presents his ideas. You asked if there's anything in there about new, and actually I think there are a couple of things in there which are new. Maybe I'll come to those.
Sure.
If I forget, remind me, and I'll try and drop them in, because we'll need to talk a bit about the metaphysics before the stuff that's new will make sense, I think.
Okay, well let's talk about the metaphysics, and his major work here is called On Possible Worlds. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah, on the plurality of
worlds.
Plurality
of worlds. So Lewis is most famous for his theory of possible worlds, which I think comes from, or it's a version of Leibniz's notion of possible worlds. Although I don't think he ends up in the same place as Leibniz does. But let's start with a real basic question then about his metaphysics. What is a possible world?
Yeah, okay. Well, actually, I think it's very easy to answer. It's easy and hard to answer the question, what is a possible world? The easy thing is I'll put it like this. Do you know what the kind of thing that you live in is? I suppose. I
see. Right. So the world I live in is what I take to be the actual world, and it's made up of all types of different objects, processes, and materials. Let's go with that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the world around you, is made up of objects that you can bang into and trip over, tables and chairs and cats and curries, things like this. And that's just what a possible world is. A possible world is just an arrangement of material things across space and time. So the actual world. And one important thing, when we say world, it's probably best to think about these as possible entire universes. So they're not like worlds in terms of possible planets or anything. It's an entire way in which a universe could have been. So our universe is a particular way. It's arranged in terms of the objects, as you just said, tables and chairs, but planets and suns and stars as well going out into the galaxy. And other possible worlds are exactly the same. They're just like the actual world, but arranged differently.
Okay, so that's perhaps a good place to sort of build on that, the idea of a possible world. So how then does it differ? How does, say, what Lewis considers to be a possible world differ from what I take in my sort of banal experience to be the actual world?
So again, not at all. There is no difference, and the only difference is that we're not located in those possible worlds. We're located in the one that we're in. So a nice way of thinking about it is in terms of location. So and indexical sentences. So an indexical is just an indexical is a term which needs a context in order for it to gain a reference. That's a way of thinking about it. So a term like here, it's an indexical term, and each person who uses it, the reference of the term is going to be different because it's going to depend upon which location they're in that it refers to. So if I say I am here, I might mean that I'm here in the UK, for example. So I am here. Here in that sentence refers to the UK. But somebody in Australia, if they say I am here, they mean that they're in Australia. And I don't think there's anything special about where I am. It just happens to be the place that I'm located at. Australia is just as real. There's no difference between it and the UK in terms of its existence or anything like that. And Lewis thinks about possible worlds in that kind of, when we say the actual world, that just means the world that we're in locates us where we are. In other possible worlds, there are people, in many of them, there are people just like us who have thoughts and they think. And when they think, I am here, or I'm in the actual world, they refer to their own world. They think their world is actual. We think our world is actual. But that's just like thinking the UK is here, and people in Australia are thinking Australia is here for them. So I think that's the best way to think about it. There's nothing special about possible worlds. The only thing that's special, nothing special about the actual world, nothing different about it. It's just that we're in it.
So it's just a way of talking about things which are not here.
Yeah, effectively. And this is, I mean, we haven't yet said anything about why he thinks that these things exist, right? So it might sound a bit crazy to people. In fact, he was aware that this view does sound crazy. So, you know, he thought he needed arguments for it, and he gives some arguments for it. But the key thing is he thinks that we ought to believe in the existence of these things in order to explain modal talk, that is, talk about possibility and necessity.
Right. So what then does Lewis's discourse on the plurality of worlds tell us about the nature of modality? Because I think of modality, I'm sort of probably a bit old-fashioned in that. I think back to Aristotle, and Aristotle sort of draws a distinction between, as you know, between the actual and the potential, or the actual and the possible. The actual is that which exists, and the potential is that which might have a tendency to come into existence, but does not, in fact, exist. Now, Lewis is making a different claim than that. As far as I understand it, he's actually saying that possible worlds exist.
That's right. So he doesn't think that the possible is some shady realm of half existence or anything like that, or he thinks that, what is possible. Well, the way to think about it is to think about, take a sentence like, there could have been unicorns, let's say. There aren't any, but there could have been. Well, that for Lewis is it is a modal sentence. It says possibly there are unicorns. And for Lewis, he just takes the possibly there actually to be what we call a quantifier over. He thinks it means there is a possible world in which a unicorn exists or unicorns exist. So it's an existential theory. So what is possible is just what exists in other possible worlds.
I think this is probably where people start to be a little puzzled with Lewis. They start thinking, okay, is an outcome of his logic, therefore, that in other possible worlds, he is actually saying that unicorns exist?
Yeah, that's right. He's committed, indeed, to the existence of things like unicorns. It's just they don't exist here in our world. They exist in other possible worlds. And that's a very basic idea that he thinks he can analyze, basically all talk about possibility and necessity. So when we say something like necessarily 2 + 2 = 4, that's a necessary truth. His way of thinking about that is that's a necessary truth because it's one that's true in all possible worlds. So things that are possible are things that are true in some possible worlds. Things that are necessary are things that are true in all possible worlds. And that's the way he analyzes possibility.
Right. So that's a useful way to think about it, I think, because if he's talking about, say, necessary truths, so we have in philosophy a dichotomy, I suppose, or a distinction between necessary truths and, I suppose, contingent truths. So contingent truths tend to be factual truths, roughly, and necessary truths are true by definition. So, for example, something like, I don't know, such as mathematical truths, like 1 + 1 = 2, triangle has 3 sides is a geometrical truth, and I don't know, you could have laws about sets and stuff like that. Now that kind of helps to me. So those truths are true in all possible worlds, irrespective of the worlds, even if there's a world where unicorns exist. But that kind of makes sense to me if you think about it, because right, when we're talking with mathematical terms, triangles, sets, or number or equations or whatever, in some sense, we don't actually think that they exist, at least in the same sense that we think, the cup exists or the table exists. So is that his innovation then? Is possible worlds his way of helping us talk about things which are not contingently true, I suppose?
I think so, but I mean, he does want to say that, how can we put this? I think it's the contingent, or the things that are possibly true but not necessarily true, which he's most interested in.
Right.
That's what it does turn out to be true that mathematical truths and all the others, the analytic truths that you mentioned, and things like bachelors are unmarried men and so on, which is really to say bachelors are unmarried men is actually to say, really, I think something like necessarily, if anything is a bachelor, then it is an unmarried man. Notice it's got a necessarily on the front. That means in all possible worlds, if something is a bachelor in that world. So he does want to analyze those analytic necessary truths in terms of possible worlds. But I think the real use of them comes through things which are possible but not necessarily true. Things like there are, I mean, maybe we could think about it like this. Truths like that, there might have been unicorns, which is I take it, a truth.
Right. So yeah, sorry, Ben, to cut across, but I'm kind of getting this. So it's like he's talking about, so possible worlds helps us talk about contingent truth. So what is a contingent truth? So let's break it down. Yeah. So say it is a contingent truth that I am sitting here talking to you. So, for example, it could have been otherwise. We tried to record this last week. We had an aborted effort. Yeah. But I am here. It is true, and it's a contingent truth. But it could have been otherwise. I don't know. I might have tripped coming up the stairs.
So, I mean, I was just going to sort of say that when we're talking about things like there might have been unicorns and so on. That's one thing. It's not very. I mean, it's kind of interesting to us. But what we're really interested in is how things could have been with regards to different from how things actually are. How things could have been. You know, I didn't have any breakfast this morning. I just had a cup of coffee, but I could have had cornflakes for breakfast. You know, we talk about counterfactual situations. We talk about all the time. You know, what would have happened if Germany had won the Second World War? We might ask, we say, well, if Germany had won the Second World War, then, and we draw out conclusions, perhaps we'd all be speaking German now instead of English or something like that. And these are all really understood as being, I mean, first of all, if you say what would have happened if Germany had won the Second World War, we have to think, well, it's possible they could have won the Second World War. And if they had done, then what would have happened? So Lewis's thought is, possible worlds is, well, we imagine a possible world where they did win the Second World War, and then we try to figure out, well, what would have followed from that. So, yeah.
Interesting. Right. Interesting. So I'm trying to figure out, is there a heuristic here? You said it's useful, right? So he's talking about counterfactuals. Okay. So ordinarily, you know, I think I tell my students, I'm sure you probably do as well, is to generally avoid counterfactuals. You know, I mean, I don't like counterfactuals. I just like, you know, it's just a sort of a matter of taste. I mean, it's like, what is the point of talking about it? And you see, for example, to give an example of a counterfactual, you see it in politics a lot, which gets on my nerves. That's just me, right? So what would have happened if, I don't know, Jeremy Corbyn became prime minister and won the last general election, right? Mm-hmm. There's no point talking about that. It's past, it's gone. It doesn't refer to anything specific in the world. And it is therefore useless. But I think Lewis is making a more subtle point. He's saying in some way that it's useful to talk about these counterfactuals because they tell us something about the world we are in. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think that's going to be his general view of what counterfactuals are used for. And I mean, I think his view would be that we use them all the time. So when we're planning for the future, we imagine different ways the future could possibly go. You know, we think, well, what if I do this? What would happen? What if I do that? What would happen? Of course, we know we can't do both of them. We're only going to do one of them. So if we're imagining different future situations, we're really imagining different possible worlds than the one that we necessarily are in, because in the one that we're in, we're only going to do one of those things. So that's a kind of a future-looking counterfactual where you're considering possible worlds, not knowing which world you're in at that point, I suppose, if you don't know what decision you're going to make. So even when we plan things for the future, I think it involves a kind of forward-looking counterfactual reasoning, but we base those on thinking about what happened in the past. So I don't know. Think about, you know, if you leave home at 9 or 8:30 to get to work and get stuck in the traffic, one of your reasoning is, if I'd have left earlier, I wouldn't have got stuck in this traffic. That's a counterfactual. And the next day that might lead you, by reflection upon that, to leave your house a little bit earlier. And so counterfactuals are useful in that sense, I think. But Lewis, his primary aim was to analyse counterfactuals, to try to give an account of what they mean, I think. And that's where he brings in the possible worlds. So yes, they're useful. And Lewis, I think, thought they were useful. His main aim is to offer an analysis of them. In
that sense, I can see where that would be useful in a philosophical sense, where you're talking about questions of probability and prediction, right? As in, you know, I can see why we do that all the time. As in, I'm going to go to the shop tomorrow. Oh, it's raining, whatever, you know. or I'll need to take my Mac if it's raining, whatever. I think I'm just allergic to counterfactuals, Ben. even like in sci-fi, like, which I love sci-fi, or good sci-fi. The one genre of sci-fi I don't like is alternative history. Right? I don't know why. It's just I suppose an example of more recently would be The Man in the High Castle. I'm slightly digressing here, but what is the point about talking about whether the Nazis won World War II? Like, they bloody didn't, and that's a good thing too. So let's talk about the actual one. But that's really been helpful to me because, talking about sort of predictive statements and promissory statements and, future statements, that does help me see how this can be useful to explain those things. Now, sorry, you wanted to say something.
Well, yeah, I suppose, I was thinking of, if you go back to, as well as the counterfactual reasoning, there are, because you mentioned Aristotle, I was thinking as well that it's not just that it gives us an analysis of counterfactuals that are useful in sort of everyday life, but also that it gives some sort of answers to some famous historical, philosophical problems, and gives a new kind of analysis and a new insight into the meaning of various historically important philosophical terms. So the one that comes from Aristotle is the notion of an essence, right? Mm-hmm. The notion of an essential property. And Aristotle thought that each thing that exists has got some essential property that makes it what it is. So, he thought that, for example, species, being human, we are essentially human. And what that means to say that the thing is essentially human is that it could not have existed without being human. It's a modal claim. It's about possibility. So
its possibilities are its essence.
In effect, or it's rather its essence restricts what's possible for an individual, right? So, if we take it that I'm essentially human, that's compatible with me having different coloured hair. It's compatible with me not having to wear glasses as I do, or something like that. So, we can say there are certain possibilities for me. I could have had different coloured hair. I could have had perfect vision. I don't. But one thing that's not possible for me, I couldn't have been a dog, right? And the Aristotelian account is supposed to explain that. Why couldn't I have been a dog? Well, because my essence is to be human. It's part of what I am in a metaphysically fundamental or interesting sense. Lewis basically he doesn't like that notion, just fades out. It's a mysterious notion, I think, this idea of essence. It's almost kind of supernatural in a metaphysical way, but Lewis does away with it. He doesn't need essence in his account. So, how can I put it? Lewis takes stuff that's in Aristotle, seems to be difficult to make sense of and seems a bit mysterious, and turns it into something which is perfectly understandable. So for him, there's no such thing as an essential property in the Aristotelian sense. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is just that Lewis's work, it pertains and it bears upon a whole host of interesting philosophical issues that were historically of importance, and gives them a new twist. So I haven't said what that twist is yet, but it should get some idea that it's important because it rejects that kind of Aristotelian idea.
Is there other examples of philosophical problems then that Lewis's discourse has generated? What's interesting to me about this, Ben, is that philosophers often get accused of not being able to make progress. And we're still talking about Aristotle, we're still talking about Plato, and so on and so forth. But say, does Lewis's logic of a plurality of worlds, could it help solve something like, say, I don't know, the free will and determinism problem? Now, could we go and say, actually, yeah, we've solved that one now. We're not free.
Well, yeah, if the free will debate, actually, Lewis does have something to say about the free will debate, and he's got a very famous paper called "Are We Free to Break the Laws?" where he responds to an argument from Van Imwagen, this guy Peter Van Imwagen, who argues that
he's great, Van Imwagen. Sorry, I like Van Imwagen.
Me too. I think he's another great philosopher. And Van Imwagen's got this a very famous paper as well, argument called "The Incompatibility of Free Will and Determinism," and Lewis has got a response to that, which actually, not in that paper, but elsewhere in another paper. I think it's in one called "New Work through a theory of universals. He cashes out what determinism means in terms of possible worlds. And anyway, he argues that it's not. He's a compatibilist. So it's like, yeah, if you buy into the Lewisian program, you get an answer to whether free will is compatible with determinism, for example. You get an answer to what Aristotelian essences really are. You get an answer to, and a bunch of other puzzles. So there's puzzles of material constitution. You know, you've got these are traditional philosophical puzzles. You've got a lump of clay. You mold it into a statue. What's going on in that situation? Have you got, once you've molded it into a statue, how many things are on the table? Is there both a lump of clay and a statue, or are those two things distinct? You know, are the two things in the same place at the same time? What do we say about that situation? Lewis's metaphysics gives you an answer there. Problems of personal identity. How do we persist over time? Do we persist as animals? Are we identical with the animals that we, you know, that our minds are associated with? Or are we psychological beings who could continue in other bodies? Lewis gives you an answer to that. A whole host of different philosophical problems all get solved if you buy into Lewis's system.
What about the distinction between fiction and reality, say? So let me take an example off the top of my head, right? So Lewis believes that possible worlds exist in the modal contingencies that you're talking about. They're real, they're fully real. They're real as the actual world. So there is a real concrete universe where Manchester City beat Manchester United in every single Manchester derby, right?
Yep. In actual fact, it's not quite true to say that there's a world in which Manchester, what was it? Manchester City beat
Manchester United
in all of their matches. Because so this is one important aspect of Lewis's view, and it's that things only exist in one possible world. So you only exist in this possible world, and when we talk about what's possible for you, what we're not doing on Lewis's view is imagining you inhabiting a different possible world, or we're not considering you existing in other possible worlds and seeing what you did there. What we're doing is we're imagining something that's very much like you, a counterpart of you in that world. So really, we want to say this. We want to say it's possible for Manchester City to have beaten Manchester United in all of their matches because there is a possible world in which a counterpart of Manchester City beat a counterpart,
but not the actual.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I get it. And does that then speak to the difference between truth and fiction, then, doesn't it, as well?
I think so. So, I mean, I'm not. So, when you were thinking about fiction, so let's take an example. Let's take the Sherlock Holmes books.
Right.
It's a traditional one that gets used when people discuss fiction in analytic philosophy. At any rate, it's always Sherlock Holmes for some reason. But yeah, let's take Sherlock Holmes.
He's a detective.
Yeah, and meant to be very logical. Perhaps many philosophers see Sherlock Holmes as some sort of a fictional hero because of his the way he. It would seem right for analytics. Who, by the way, would a continental philosopher?
It's because he liked drugs. It's because he was a drug addict.
Could be that, yeah. I'd say what continental philosophers are going to take, like Meursault in Camus' L'Estrange or something, as their philosophical heroes.
Christ. So go around killing Arabs. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, but we're safer. We stick with the Sherlock Holmes. So take Sherlock Holmes. What's the question here? So the Sherlock Holmes books are fictional. They're things that didn't happen. We do make judgments. So here's an interesting thing about, that it might not be stated anywhere in the Sherlock Holmes novels how tall Sherlock Holmes is. I don't know whether it is or it isn't, but perhaps it never says. What does that mean about Sherlock Holmes in the fictional stories? Does it mean that he has got no determinate height, or what? And Lewis offers a kind of answer to this as well. So he says, well, we can think about fictional stories as being classes of possible worlds, i.e. all of those possible worlds which are consistent with what's actually written down, but we import various things into them by looking at worlds that. So we basically, when we read the Sherlock Holmes novels, even though it never says how tall he is, we presume that he wasn't 4 centimeters tall, right? And we presume that he's not 26 feet tall or something like that. So there's a range of possibilities which are relevant. He might have been 6 foot tall, he might have been 5'11" or something. And the way we can think about that is the Sherlock Holmes books describe situations which happen in certain possible worlds, and we limit our attention to those possible worlds which are closest to our own in which they happen. So there is a possible world where a Sherlock Holmes exists and was 5'11" and did all the things that Sherlock Holmes did. There is one where he's 6 foot tall and does all the things, and so on and so forth. But there is going to be a possible world out there where he's 4 centimeters tall as well. It's just we don't think about that one. That one gets cut off from our consider. So reading a book of fiction is almost like reading about a class of possible worlds. You can think about it like that.
Right, yeah, and that's why people sort of say that he's a bit of a sort of a sci-fi philosopher in some sense. You know, that he's there is some world, possible world out there where Sherlock Holmes exists and, you know, goes around with Dr. Watson solving crime. Oh,
yep, those worlds are out. I mean, you got to, I mean, the range of possible worlds is just enough. So, okay.
Is it infinite?
Here's a question. Yeah, I think so. Infinite, yeah. Yeah, I think it has to be infinite because think about it like this. For every world there could have been, well, take it like this. Take the number of particles that there are in the actual world, right? Maybe there are infinitely many in the actual world, I don't know, but take the number of particles that there are.
Well, we could draw a distinction between infinite and innumerable, perhaps.
Yeah, but however many there are in the actual world, there could have been one more. So there's a world where there's one more, and then there could have been another one. So there's a world where there's another one, and there could have been another one, and then so you can quickly get to an infinite number of possible worlds just by realizing that there could have been one extra object, and there could have been 2 extra objects, and 3 extra objects, and 4 and 5 and 6. You know, no limit. So yeah, there are infinitely many possible worlds, and this is one important point I was going to quickly make was Lewis offers us a way of figuring out which things are possible, and it's simply his account of which things are possible is simply thought of like this. Well, a world is really just an aggregate of particles. So really, he's a physicalist in the sense that he thinks that our world contains no mental things. He does allow, by the way, that there are possible worlds where there are mental things, you know, Cartesian minds and stuff like that. But they're far away because they're not close to the possible world. Right. But at any rate, our world is one that's just made up of an arrangement of particles. That's what it is. So all the facts about us, we've got brains, which are just arrangements of particles in various ways, from which somehow or other arises our consciousness. But effectively, the whole world is an arrangement of particles, and you can rearrange those particles however much you want. And if there is, for every rearrangement of particles that there is a world that's that way. And you can get to pretty much any world you like just by rearranging and adding particles of the same sort, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm wondering, right, in terms of, well, you know, one of the classical philosophical questions is the epistemological one. How do we ascertain truth and its conditions? I'm wondering where that plays for Lewis. I wonder if there's like an infinite egress. I think I know what you're going to say here, but I wanted to try you out, right? I think I know how you're going to answer this. So I'm wondering, you know, when we're talking about infinity, is there an infinite egress there? So if there is, or if there are innumerable possible worlds or infinite possible worlds, right, where it is true, say that Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister, and there is a world that is the case according to Lewis.
Yep.
Then in that possible world, and indeed in the actual world, can it not be the case that Jeremy Corbyn is and is not the Prime Minister at the same time, and thereby, I suppose, falling to a contradiction?
Okay. I think I see the idea of the question. I might have to ask you to repeat a bit of it, but Lewis says this about there is no. So a possible world is a possible arrangement of particles, if you like, across space and time, and there is a world in which a counterpart of Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister, and that's just because, you know, you can arrange the particles in a world such that, in a way that mean that he won the election. So you can keep the world exactly the same up until the point of the election, let's say. So the two worlds, this world and the world in which a counterpart of Jeremy Corbyn wins the election are going to be the same up until the point when Corbyn won, but then they diverge. So then there's a difference where Corbyn wins. But in none of those worlds is a contradiction going to be true. So in no possible world can you have it being the case that, well, it being the case that something is the case and not the case. So
that makes sense to me. I'm just wondering, though, in terms of like sort of counterfactuals, would he not have to admit of that in some way? I'm only I think you're following my thought that there has to be worlds where contradictions exist, if all possible worlds.
Well, Lewis says not. So Lewis says he's got. I can't remember it now, but he's got this thought where he talks about, to think that there are worlds where contradictions are true is, and he talks about, imagine there's a mountain where contradictions are true. But I can't remember his argument now. But anyway, he's got this argument that no, there can't be any possible worlds. But interestingly, other people have said, well, sometimes we do reason using counterfactuals with impossible antecedents. So, you know, we might think something like this. So take an example. Take Goldbach's conjecture. So,
could you explain that, Ben?
Sure. So Goldbach's conjecture is the thesis that every even number higher than 2 is the sum of 2 prime numbers. So, for example, 4 is the sum of 2 and 2, 6 is the sum of 3 and 3, 8 is the sum of 5 and 3, 10 is the sum of 5 and 5, 12 is the sum of 7, and
so on.
Right? 7 and 5. And the thing about Goldbach's conjecture, it's interesting because nobody's ever been able to find a counterexample to it. For every even number that has been checked, and they've used computers to check up into, you know, huge digits, it's always been found that every even number that they've looked at is the sum of 2 primes. But nobody's ever been able to prove that Goldbach's conjecture is definitely 100, definitely true. It might be that it's an improvable mathematical statement. In fact, we know that there are going to be some unprovable mathematical statements, and that might be one of them. We don't know which ones they are. So, right, we don't know whether, in other words, there's a counterexample to Goldbach's conjecture out there in somewhere in the infinity of numbers. You know, we can't check that using computers because no matter how far we go up, there's always more. So here's the point of talking about Goldbach's conjecture. Sorry, I'll get to the point. The point is that we might reason as follows. We might say, well, what would happen if Goldbach's conjecture were true? And what would happen if Goldbach's conjecture were false? Now, one of those is, if it's true, it's necessarily true. And if it's false, it's necessarily false. So, on Lewis's view, either Goldbach's conjecture is true in all possible worlds, or it's false in all possible worlds. But then if we're using counterfactual reasoning, suppose it's necessarily true and therefore true in all possible worlds, when we say, well, if Goldbach's conjecture is false, then, if we imagine that counterfactual, then aren't we imagining an impossible world, one where...
Right, yeah, that's kind of what I'm driving at, yeah.
Yeah, some people have pushed that line. For example, one of Lewis's graduate students, a chap called Daniel Nolan, who is, in his own right, a well-known analytic philosopher now, he thought that you need impossible worlds as well as possible worlds. And he's given an account, a broadly Lewisian account, but also including impossible worlds as well. Lewis rejects that. He never got on board with that. He never thought you needed impossible worlds, but some people do think that and have argued for that view.
Okay, and I'm aware now that we're sort of coming to the close, so there is a couple of other things I want to talk to you about.
Yeah.
In terms of this possible worlds, we kind of touched on it already. The question is, I suppose, linked to the question of probability. I think this probably, to my mind at least, this should get to the heart of David Lewis's metaphysics. Although I'm not sort of equipped or knowledgeable enough to say why. But I can say why, but I don't know if it's accurate, right? So I'll put that to you. In what way does Lewis's discourse of possible worlds relate to the question of probability? In particular, I'm thinking here of the question of causation. You know, that one thing precedes and determines another.
Yeah. So. It's going to be difficult to get to probability, I think, but causation we can. So the fact of the matter is that to really touch upon everything that we would need to talk about to really understand Lewis would probably take a sort of 5-6 hours of discussion. So,
it's always next week.
So the one thing we haven't talked about at all is his commitment to what he calls Humeanism. So David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, famously argued that, in fact, there's no such thing as causation. Causation is all in our minds, according to David Hume, roughly speaking. So his view was every time we see one thing cause another, one billiard ball was one of his favourite examples, banging into another one, we never see the causation there. All we see is one thing happening followed by another. And Hume thought that we therefore have this psychological expectation when we see one thing happening and another, that it's going to happen like that again and again. So we project this idea, the mental expectation in some sense gets projected into the world. Now, that makes sense to me, because probability is a type of possibility talk, right? Yeah, I think so. So, Hume thought the ordinary idea, or the pre-theoretical intuitive idea of causation, is of one thing necessitating another thing. That, when one thing causes another, he thinks that we've got this idea of it making the second one happen of necessity. If there is any causation in the world, it's somehow a mental projection into, we see one billiard ball hit another. According to Hume, we don't actually see one billiard ball cause another, and his thought was the ordinary intuitive idea of causation is of one thing making another thing happen, one thing necessitating the other. So we think that, if we throw a brick at a window and the window smashes, the ordinary idea is that the window had to have smashed once the brick was thrown. It couldn't not have smashed, or something like that. And Hume just thinks that's nonsense. There's nothing in the world that makes it the case that the brick necessitates the smashing of the window. And Lewis takes over this position, and he thinks that causation, it's not a real thing in the world. It doesn't drive things. So, we might think, why does the world carry on in the way that it does? If I let go of something, why does it drop to the floor? If I throw a brick at a window, why does it smash? And a lot of people want to appeal to the laws of nature there and say, well, it's because there are these things called the laws of nature which act as a kind of a driving force of the universe and drive things on and make things happen according to them. On the Lewisian view, that's all, because he's a Humean, that's all nonsense. Really, the laws of nature, according to Lewis, are just descriptions of regularities that occur across time. That's all they are. So, could the laws of nature be broken? Yeah, of course they could. You throw a brick at a window and it smashes. There are other possible worlds out there where bricks are thrown and the window doesn't smash, and instead the brick bounces off. And so there's no sense in which the laws of nature are necessary or that they make anything happen in the world. So and I think that's going to tie in with the notions of probability as well. Probabilities aren't really built into the fabric of the world. Rather, they are somehow psychological things about us, right? There's no real probability in the world. Rather, probabilities are all just to do with our knowledge of the world. Something like that.
There's something quite liberating about that. Things could always be otherwise, things could have been otherwise, even if they're not. So the world is as it is, for sure, but in another sense, it shows us that the world could be otherwise. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know what. I think people. I could see where people take ethical succor or even political succor for that. Now, I'm not really interested for our discussion or what sort of Lewis's politics was, but I can kind of see how the idea is appealing, other than things which are necessarily true in all possible worlds.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that's worth mentioning about this is that another thing that we haven't really touched upon is Lewis's Eternalism. And this means that Lewis thought that the future exists in just the same way as the past. Again, it's a kind of located thing. We're in the present moment, but really that's just the moment that we're located at. The future is, for Lewis, already laid out. It's already there, right? And it's worth noting.
It's predetermined.
Right, but he doesn't think it's predetermined. So the future is already there, but it doesn't mean that it's determined. And that strikes people as odd. But the way of thinking about it is, well, when we say that the future is predetermined, do we just mean that it couldn't be or it can't be any other way than it will be? And Lewis thinks that's false. So although the future will be a certain way, the future could be other ways than it will be. Because there are other possible worlds in which the future is different from the possible world in the actual world. And you can think about it like this. We think that the past is fixed in a sense, right? The past is there. You know, all the truths about the fact. So Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon on blah, blah, whatever the date was. Queen Elizabeth II was coronated on whatever that date was. We think all of those things are fixed. They're facts about the past. But of course, that doesn't mean that things couldn't have been otherwise in the past. Things could have been different. Julius Caesar could have crossed the Rubicon on a different day, or Queen Elizabeth could have been coronated on a different day. So although the past is a certain way, it could have been a different way. And the same is meant to be true of the future. Although the future is a certain way, it could turn out to be other ways. And that's consistent for Lewis. So yeah, you do get this liberation that even if we are, there's only one future, it's still not true that that's the way the future must be.
So it reminds me of Bergson a little bit. Anyway, that's a different podcast. I think, one of the things that I read in preparation for this, I did manage to do some prep for this, but
right,
he wrote an article on time travel, right?
Yep.
Right. So, and in some sense, he's what intrigued me about that was his picture of the human being. He pictures us, as I understand it. Well, he asks about what is the possibility of time travel, or what are the conditions in which time travel would be possible. But in a way, I get the impression he's actually talking about us, individuals, Ben, Patrick, in the actual world, and he's kind of saying that in some sense we are actually kind of like time travelers in a way. We move from point A to point B.
So he says that if we're going to ask about the possibility of time travel, we need to give a definition of what time travel is, because we're all, in a sense, time travelers. Because if to be a time traveler was simply to exist at two different times, so you existed in 1990, you exist now in 2021. So you exist in that time, you exist in this time. Therefore, does that make you a time traveler? He thinks, well, yeah, in a sense that's true, but in the sense in which we want to understand whether time travel is possible, we don't just mean that, right? We mean something else. And he defines it as, so this is in his paper, The Paradoxes of Time Travel. And that's there he defines time travel in terms of personal time and external time. And he says that a true time traveler occurs when there's a difference between a person's personal time and external time. And you can think roughly of personal time as being the time that's on your wristwatch. So imagine you're wearing a wristwatch that's accurate, then it's going to have a certain time and a date on it. If you time travel, then the time and the date on your wristwatch is going to differ from the actual the time that in the external world. So that's what he means. That's rough. In the end, I think you can't rely upon wristwatches. You've got to rely upon internal bodily processes. But that's the idea. So
just to draw things to a close then, Ben, I've got one last question for you. And that's in terms of your own sort of philosophizing and your own writing. Where have you found Lewis, this possible worlds discourse valuable?
Right. So, I mean, I really think that, what can I say about that? Because it sort of infects every aspect of my thinking when I'm writing about metaphysics. Because I kind of, even in the end, if you don't agree with Lewis, his view on possible worlds, it's usually you can clearly lay out an issue by writing it out in Lewisian terms, and then there's a way of kind of translating that talk into what other people say. So his metaphysical view gives you a framework in which to understand metaphysical problems, and you can kind of then, by tinkering with it, understand other people's positions very clearly. That's not very that doesn't really explain very well.
Well, you think it's valuable in sort of a methodological sense.
Yeah, and I mean, when I've written papers on personal identity with some of them along with an old colleague of mine, Harold Noonan, and Harold is not, he doesn't believe in Lewis's view. So Harold is what's called an endurantist. His framework is broadly a Lewisian framework apart from that. And when I'm writing papers with Harold, I always think about it in terms of Lewis's view and then translate it basically into Harold's view. So I use it as a kind of how I think about things, and then you can convert it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you've written on lots of things. You've written on you've written on the philosophy of time. You've got a book on that.
Yeah.
You've written on the philosophy of antiques, right? Or you talk, is that something, for example, I could see, if you're talking about something like an antique, try to figure out what are the necessary and sufficient conditions of an antique. I could see, where possible worlds discourse would be valuable there, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there, one of the things that I was interested in when thinking about antiques is to do with the persistence conditions of antiques. Like if you've got something at one time, suppose you've got an old chest of drawers, an antique chest of drawers, and you convert it into something else, like a wash stand or something. And this happens a lot in the antique trade. Old items get converted from one thing into another and then sold as antiques. But my question there was, well, is this legitimate? If you've taken like an old chest of drawers and turned it into something else, does that very same antique persist? Or do you destroy the original antique and, in fact, bring into existence a new object, which, ought not to be considered to be an antique because it's not the original thing that was the antique? That's a question. And, putting it in terms of Lewis's view, the possible worlds don't come in quite so much, but it's more to do with thinking about objects as being space-time worms, really, things that are spread out across space and time.
Space-time worms. That's great.
Yeah.
Sci-fi. Sci-fi.
Well, you see, I would say it's not sci-fi, but the truth about what we are, I think we are space-time
worms.
Yeah, where right now, the whole of you is not present, right? There's just a part of you. There's a part of me speaking to a part of you, a temporal part, and there's a part of me. So, at each moment that I exist, all that's present at any particular moment is just a single part of me.
Right. We should be clear. You're not talking about literal worms here. Like you're talking about it in the.
Yeah.
Exactly. It is sort of the sense of physics, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Persons and all other objects on this view are just aggregates of temporal parts. So the table is made up of lots of different temporal slices of a table from the moment it's made to the moment it gets destroyed. But the table itself is the whole of the summation of all of those stages, and people are the summation of those person stages. And they're thinking about antiques. Then the question is, okay, well, is there there is an object that's composed of the parts of the drawers before it gets changed into a washstand and the parts afterwards that are the washstand. And the question is that worm itself an antique or not? Or do we have to say that, in fact, the antique finishes a bit earlier? For these sorts of things, what I really need is a whiteboard and to do terrible drawings to try and illustrate what I'm talking about. I'm finding myself.
You do some good whiteboarding, Ben. I've seen it.
I'm finding myself as I'm talking to you, sort of drawing in the air as if I'm drawing little pictures.
So that's what's happening over there.
Yeah. So I'm aware that what I'm saying here is difficult to visual. You need a little visual aid, I think, to fully get across what I'm talking about here. But hopefully it makes sense. So on this kind of a view, we're these types of space-time worms. Yeah.
Okay, we should probably finish it there. I don't know. I was going to talk to you about Heidegger, but maybe we can do that another day.
Oh yeah, I'm interested. I am aware we've only scratched the surface and tried to get some of the key ideas in about Lewis.
Yeah, that's well. The thing about him is he's very intriguing, And I think you've presented his ideas in a very, very clear and, or as clear as would possibly can, because it is quite abstract, all this stuff. Heidegger would probably, what would Heidegger do with this? He'd probably say that there's something irrefutable about this. It's irrefutable. You know, it's not, it's neither futable or irrefutable, right? But it's, well, I mean, that would be a compliment from Heidegger, I think.
Right.
Because it's, no, I don't mean in the sort of the vague sense that Heidegger talks in abstract prose, but I mean in the sense that if it's irrefutable, it's therefore true, isn't it? So there's something good about it.
There's a thing there. I mean, that brings us really to the issue of philosophical methodology, I think. And on this front, Lewis was he believed in what's called reflective equilibrium. But this might take us too far from what so Lewis's own view was he thought that his whole philosophical system, because all of the bits fitted together it's a coherent system.
He's like Hegel.
Yeah, he was a system building philosopher. In the
in that narrow sense, yeah.
Yeah, in the introduction to his philosophical papers, he says he wished he wasn't such a systematic philosopher, and he wished that he could take problems more piecemeal. But he says that he keeps using ideas that he's developed elsewhere and applying. So he was, I think you have to read that a bit tongue-in-cheek. I think he was pleased that he was a system-building philosopher. But the point is, he thought that there were probably other equally as good philosophical systems out there that could explain as much as his could. And on the question of truth, he says, well, we might never know. I've got this system that, has got explains things in one way. You've got another perfectly coherent system that explains it in another. We might have done all the arguments that that we could give. We might have made all the tricky distinctions that we can make, and we can't, decide between my system and your system. Does that mean that we're both right? No, he says. Who's right depends upon how things actually are.
So that's reflective equilibrium then, is it?
Yeah, I mean, the reflective equilibrium is the method to come to that resting point, the overall system. You start off with your intuitions, which is your kind of common sense views about how things are. Then you come up with philosophical theories to try to explain them. And sometimes, necessarily, really, the philosophical theory is going to come into conflict with the common sense views once you draw out the consequences of it. And then you've got an option. You either revise your common sense view and give up on it, or you try and tinker with the theory to get it to fit. And the idea is you go backwards and forwards between your common sense views, sometimes giving some of those up, sometimes tinkering with the theory. And the idea is if you do that, at the end of inquiry, you'll come to a reflective equilibrium where the set of your common sense views revised and the theory suitably tinkered with cohere with each other. And that's what I think he thinks he gets close to in his philosophical system. It's a resting point of reflective equilibrium.
That's a great place to end, I think, Ben.